On today's show, the Atlanta Hawks won the draft lottery for the first time in franchise history. There is plenty to discuss. We'll get into all of the reaction, the fallout, and a very interesting 6-7 week period coming up right now.
You are Locked On Hawks, your daily Atlanta Hawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 1713 of the Locked On Hawks podcast. I am your host, Brad Rowland, coming to you on a Sunday afternoon in emergency fashion. Today's show is brought to you by the folks at Prize Picks. The easiest, most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports, and the place to go is prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA and use code LockedOnNBA for first time deposit match up to $100. Also want to encourage you at the top of the podcast, if you are a new listener or if you're a recurring listener, to make us your first listen each and every day. Please subscribe to this show anywhere you find podcasts. We're on YouTube. We're also on all of the audio platforms, including Apple and Spotify and Overcast, and again, anywhere you get your podcasts. I'll take you behind the curtain right now. I was going to record a podcast, and I still am planning to do so later on tonight with a guest that I will not name right now in reaction to the NBA draft lottery. After all, the Hawks were, I would say, quite likely to be picking somewhere in the 10 or 11 range in this draft. And yet, things changed drastically for Atlanta on Sunday afternoon. If you're listening to this podcast, you probably know this by now, but the Hawks won the lottery for the first time in franchise history. Yes, Atlanta had never won the lottery before. They had not picked at number one since 1975. That is, again, a very, very long time ago, almost 50 years ago. And even that pick became David Thompson, who's an all-time great player, but who actually decided to go to the ABA instead of the NBA. So the Hawks never even actually got David Thompson. It's been a very, very long time since they actually had their pick of the litter in the draft. That has basically never happened in my lifetime, and most people's lifetimes that listen to this podcast. The draft is still 6.5 weeks away. It begins on June 26th. But the Hawks have one pick in this draft, and it is number one overall. So I will give you this a little bit of a sneak preview. I have a lot fewer notes than I normally would as I'm recording this podcast. It's going to be a little bit shorter. It's an emergency podcast, a true emergency podcast, because I was not planning to record for several hours, but a lot to get into here. Obviously, this is very unlikely to happen. The Hawks got very lucky here. They had a 3% chance to draft number one overall, which means they had a 97% chance not to be in the number one spot. They had an 86% chance to not be in the top four anywhere. And as soon as the Hawks did not appear in the bottom 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14 picks in the lottery drawing, we knew. I was actually on a Twitter space live at the time, and I was like, well, they're jumping up to the top four. We already knew that. It happened. And then just a few minutes later, word broke, and they were number one overall. So, number one, extremely lucky to be here. The Hawks had a not terrible, but certainly annoying, frustrating, kind of brutal season overall that ended up with a early play and exit, lots of injuries, lots of underperformance. They were certainly well below expectations this year, and that led to a lot of just like questions and decisions. And look, a lot of that still applies. This is still a team that is entering the offseason that could be a lot different going into next season, which has been the case for a while. If you listen to this podcast for a while, you'll note that I talked about that they have to make choices at center. They have to make a choice in the backcourt probably, as I still am of the belief, generally speaking, that they need to break up the Trey and DeJounte pairing. That's been the case for a while now around the league. Most people believe that's probably going to be the case, or at least could be the case in the near future. They have financial decisions to make in the near future as well. But, big picture, winning the lottery is a good thing. Now, this is not the greatest draft class in the world. That has been billed to you, I'm sure, if you're listening to this podcast already, or if you've been a draft follower in the past. I know a lot of people kind of arrive at the draft on lottery day, or maybe even after that. I'm sure you heard it. In fact, you did hear it on the draft lottery broadcast on Sunday afternoon if you watched that. There is not a consensus, overwhelmingly awesome number one prospect in this draft. There's no Wemby. There's no Zion. None of those guys exist in this class. There is a guy who we'll talk about more later on in the show named Alex Sarr, who is, I would say, number one for the most people right now. And he was the only player. If you listen to the show last week, actually, I did a segment on this. There was really only one player that I was 100% or close to it sure was not going to be able to fall to the Hawks if the Hawks stuck in that 10-11 range. And it was Alex Sarr. Now, he was never guaranteed to be number one overall pick. He might be number one. The Hawks may take him. The Hawks may not take him. We will have to see on all of that. But this puts him in the range, and all of that stuff. It's pretty wild stuff. This obviously opens up the entire draft pool for Atlanta. But with that said, I should at least acknowledge how this is not the greatest draft class in the world. I have a lean of what I would do right now, that I'll get into in a second, but that's kind of the consensus at this point in time. So I got lots of questions about the lottery. Number one, I'm going to get into all kinds of draft discussion. That was going to be either way. If the Hawks had been picking 10th or 11th, I was going to spend the next 6-7 weeks doing a lot of draft preview stuff. I founded this podcast in 2016. I did full cycles of intense draft stuff because the Hawks were in the middle of a rebuild, and I've always done, I would say, more draft content on a team show than most team shows would do. I also cover the draft regularly for Diamond Up Rocks. I have for several years now. It's a passion of mine. I love the draft. With that said, I got questions about whether the Hawks should trade the pick, all that stuff. We'll get into that in a second. But also, I would say it's kind of a lot of laughter or irony or whatever it is. I kind of told the story on Twitter on Sunday afternoon before the lottery about how, the Hawks have not had that, they've not won the lottery since 1975. Well, it's never won the lottery ever. Have picked number one since 1975. And a lot of the responses were basically, well, this would be a great time for them to win it. It'd be ironic if they won it. It'd be funny if they won it. And I agree with all that because it's kind of on brand for this organization that's not had a ton of success. They've had obviously some winning seasons, all that stuff, but they've not won a championship in Atlanta. They have one in St. Louis before I was born. All that said, it is kind of ironic that the Hawks finally win a lottery and get a huge lottery boost even in a year where there is not a consensus number one overall pick. And it's probably the least hyped lottery in my adult life. Maybe you could say 2013, 2000 the other comparison. That was an awful draft by all accounts. That was, again, I was in high school when that happened. So it's been a very long time. All that said, I do think that it is funny. It's a little bit eye-rolly that the Hawks won this lottery, but that should not take anything away from the excitement level that I know some Hawks fans have, and they should. This is a great opportunity. Whether you pick it, whether you trade whether you make a trade, you are the center of the conversation if you're the Atlanta Hawks for the next 6 weeks. Yes, the NBA playoffs are happening. The finals will happen in June. That, of course, is a huge part of the league-wide conversation. But for a lot of teams, a lot of fans of one team, they kind of tap out along the way. Now, I love the playoffs. I'm going to be covering them all the way through, all that stuff. But there are people that kind of just tap out when their team loses, and that's that. But then it's offseason time. And the Hawks are going to be the number one discussion every time the draft comes up between now and June 26th. And that's a huge driver's seat to be in. Now, the entire league knows that the number one pick is not, quote unquote, worth what it usually is because there is no Zion. There is no Wembanyama. There's no AD in this class. But it's still number one overall. And that gives you the pick that you want to have. So teams might fall in love with Alex Sarr, or they might fall in love with Rob Dillingham. They might fall in love with Zachary Richeche or Donovan Clingan. There are 5, 6, maybe even 7 guys that could conceivably go number one in this class. I used the comparison last week. I'll say it again now about 2013, which was obviously a misfire. Anthony Bennett went number one overall. He was out of the league a few years later, a terrible pick. But that was a class where there was no number one overall pick. And yeah, they made a surprising selection, but everyone knew going into that day, there was a 4, 5, 6 player range of what the Cavs might do in 2013. Now, we might know more. I might have intel by the time we get to late June. It's too early for that right now as to what the Hawks are thinking, because again, you couldn't possibly prepare for this scenario. I'm sure, at least the Hawks, if they're doing their jobs, have a board that is, hey, our favorite guy right now is this player, or maybe it's a tier of players. We'll see. They'll obviously do more evaluation. They'll have in-person workouts. They'll do more talks and interviews, all that stuff. But for now, the Hawks have the cards. They can pick whoever they want to. They can make a trade if they want to, and that gives you a fantastic spot. And really, Atlanta is right in the middle of the conversation, and it goes beyond the draft stuff. There's also trade stuff. There's also roster stuff coming off of a brutal year. But after a disappointing season, I know definitely maddened a lot of Hawks fans. This is a very kind of bright and shining light that opens up a lot of doors, gets people a lot excited. I've already seen depth charts with rookies penciled in. It's going to be a wild ride in the next 6 weeks. But strap in. The Hawks won the lottery for the first time ever. They have the number one overall pick for the first time in 49 years. And I'll be covering it in depth in the next several weeks before the actual big day arrives on June 26th. All right, I'll have more on some actual analysis stuff about what the Hawks might do with this pick in a second. But first, a word from our partners on today's show. Today's show is brought to you by Prize Picks, and you can win up to 100 times the money on Prize Picks, which is as little as 4 correct picks. You can do that throughout the entire playoff action in the NBA and the basketball world right now. And they have everything for every sports fan, honestly. For basketball, they have hockey, League of Legends, everything in between LeBron and Caitlin Clark, Connor McDavid, Jude Bellingham, all in the same entries. And Prize is the best way to get on the action in more than 30 states across the country. That includes Georgia, in addition to California and Texas. And they have injury insurance as well. that your interest can stay in play, even if they have one of the players who happens to get injured for your roster. For basketball stuff, somebody exits the game in the first half, and then in return, you actually get your money back at PrizePicks and not have it be a loss like it would be in some other places. You can test your skills at PrizePicks all the time and turn $10 into $1,000, which is a few taps of your mouse or on your phone. PrizePicks is really simple to play. I can make the picks and submit my entries in just 60 seconds or less as well. It's quick withdrawals. They have easy gameplay, and enormous selection of players and stat types that you can't find anywhere else. And that makes PrizePicks the #1 fantasy sports app. They have weekly promotions and special offers for the biggest moments in sports. You can also have Apple Pay, quick and easy deposits into your account this basketball season. And by the way, all that said, the best place to go right now is prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA, or download the app right now and use code LockedOnNBA for first time deposit match up to $100. One more time, that's prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA, or download the app right now and use promo code LockedOnNBA for a first time deposit match up to $100. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy with PrizePicks. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, and it's winner take all time now in the NBA and NHL. FanDuel's going to give you a shot to bring home the big win that you are seeking. And right now, new customers at FanDuel get $150 in terms of dollars in bonus bets. So any winning $5 bet at FanDuel, that's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and much more. I've been checking out FanDuel for quite some time now. They have all the sports that you're looking for across the board. They have the NBA, they have college basketball, they have the WNBA, they have all the football stuff you're looking for when it's in season or out of season, futures, etc. They have baseball, they have college baseball even, they have soccer, they have golf, tennis, MMA, boxing. The entire gamut of sports is available to you at FanDuel. Also, you have things like futures, you have player props, you have game props, you have spreads and money lines, and totals, all that fun stuff. You even have live in-game betting and same-game parlays. They've got the entire option slate for you at FanDuel Sportsbook. You can't go wrong checking them out. And the place to go is FanDuel.com/LockedOn. One more time, that's FanDuel.com/LockedOn, and make every single playoff shot count with the folks at FanDuel. FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook. All right, and I will stress this now. I am not going to just unload the clip right here on my full analysis. I have a guest coming on hopefully later on tonight into Monday, that I'll have more of that on. And by the way, I have a list of, I wish I could show you to you now, a list of potential guests that I'm going to be asking to come on the show in the next 7 weeks. And again, that would have happened either way, but I'm sure people will be more interested now on what the Hawks are going on and evaluating all that stuff. So we'll talk lots about this. But I mentioned some names before the break. First off, Alex Sarr is the guy that I personally have #1 on my board right now. If you made me choose someone to draft for the Hawks on May 12th, which you don't have to do right now, but if you had to make that pick, I would take Alex Sarr. Now, I'll be the first to say I have more to watch on these guys. This is not my full-time job. If you're Jonathan Gavoni or Sam Vecini or John Wasserman, you might have enough information right now to be more comfortable than I am. I have watched these guys play. I've watched all of them play. I've watched Alex Sarr play multiple times. But he was, again, kind of just to be fully transparent, he was the guy that I thought was the least likely to be a Hawk because the Hawks had such a long shot chance of being in the top 1, 2, 3 of this draft. But now I have more to watch, obviously, on Alex Sarr. But the short version of who he is, Alex Sarr is not a college player. So a lot of the top guys in this draft are not American college players, which makes it harder to evaluate them if you are a more casual fan. Alex Sarr played this year in Perth in the NBL in Australia. He's listed 7'1", 19-year-old, 7'4" wingspan, was very productive this year in Australia. He's extremely athletic, potential to switch, has some good touch, he can face up. He's a really, really good athlete, opens up a lot of doors for you as a pick-and-roll guy potentially, can certainly contest shots in the back end. He's really, really fast in a way that like young Clint Capella was, for instance, like not Hawks Capella, but Houston Capella, that kind of guy. He has gotten a lot more polished as I've watched him the last year or so. He can shoot. We'll see how good the jump shot is. He's actually was at least a decent enough off dribble shooter this year a couple times. The finishing is what I'm really intrigued by. He's a real lob threat. I think defensively, that's where you have the most intrigue. Now, there are some questions about his defensive rebounding. He's not the biggest center necessarily, just for a comparison for the Hawks. He's much bigger than Okongwu. He's much longer than Okongwu, but Okongwu probably had the more traditional center archetype in terms of skill set, dating back to his one season in college, whereas Sarr has played some 4, played some 5. There have been some Jaren Jackson Jr. comparisons. Not the same player, but kind of that same archetype of like a guy who has enough size to play center, but also might be able to play some 4 for you in the future. I think that I'm intrigued about him as a center, potentially as the full-time anchor of a defense. Again, really good athlete. Instincts are really good as a rim protector. He can defend in space. He can switch. And I think for me, the most appealing thing about Alex Sarr is the fact that his defensive ceiling is absolutely through the roof. Now, that does not mean he's going to get there. It's really hard to kind of put all that together, but I'm sure you'll probably hear people that are optimistic throw out a Bam Adebayo comparison defensively. And he's also longer than Bam Adebayo. He's taller than Bam Adebayo. And by the way, I'm not saying he's going to be this player. If your projection was taller than Bam Adebayo, that is a number one overall pick. It is. That doesn't mean he would be the greatest player of all time. But Bam Adebayo is a star. Like, he's not a top 10 player in the league, but he's probably a top 20 player in the league. He's an excellent player on both ends of the floor. Maybe some Evan Mobley comparisons will be out there. I think he's a little bit more of a center than Mobley, but we'll see. He is raw offensively. I will say that. I do think that his ultimate archetype because of that is hopefully he can play center full time. If he can't, not the biggest deal in the world. We'll see. There are immediate questions that I've gotten from people. I can't answer them all now, but we'll try to get to them all over the next 6 weeks about him. If you draft him, what does it mean for Okongwu? Great question. I do think that inherently, if the Hawks were to settle on Alex Sarr and have that's their guy, it would make it less likely that Okongwu is going to be their long-term guy, because they are not the same player, but they do overlap quite a bit. And I think if you had ideally a center combination of Sarr and someone else, it probably wouldn't be Okongwu archetypally. Those guys are really good. I think Okongwu's really good still, but I think that this is, if your entire investment was just to have Okongwu in Atlanta, this isn't the greatest thing in the world for you, because if they love Sarr, I think those guys, again, doesn't mean you have to move him, but it would be probably a little bit easier to move on from Okongwu under that circumstances. Capella is kind of a separate discussion. You don't make the decision based on Capella. And by the way, I've said this before. I'll say it again right now to make it very clear. You don't draft for this year. Number one overall pick, you pick the best prospect available. This guy may not help you win a ton as a rookie. In fact, most rookies don't help you win. Some of them do. The greatest guys do. Sometimes older guys do. But that's not why you're drafting this pick. You're drafting the guy who you think is going to be the best player in 3 years, in 5 years, etc. That's what you do here. And positionally, I think that the entire spectrum should be open for the Hawks. The only thing that I probably would not do if I was Atlanta, and I've said this before, I'll say it again now, would be to take a small guard, let's say. Rob Dillingham of Kentucky, who's a small scoring point guard. I wouldn't do that on a team with Trae Young, because if you don't know this podcast well, I think that Trae is a guy that I would keep and build around. He's a really good player, all that stuff. I wouldn't draft Rob Dillingham or that kind of archetype. Everything else, though, should be on the table, whether it's wings, whether it's shooting guards, whether it's forwards, centers, etc. Pick the best player would be what I would say. After that, and we'll get more into Sarr, I promise you, later on, but he's probably the most likely pick that I can think of right now, based on what I have heard, what I have seen, what I have read. Again, it's not just Hawk stuff, because they were not talking about the number one overall pick right now until recently. But that's what I would guess. I think that Sarr is the most likely single pick at this moment. That could certainly change. Now, other guys who could be in the mix at number one overall. I would say Zachary Richeche is probably the guy that I've heard the most discussion about. I think ESPN's Jonathan Givony still has him number one overall on his board. He's a 6'8" forward, 19-year-old as well, really long. He's a really good, interesting shooter at 6'9", 6'8", something like that. He can relocate and space the floor. Not the best athlete in the world, but certainly has some athleticism and some tools. Him and Jalen work together long term. I have more tape to watch on him too. I think defensively he could be pretty interesting. It might take a little while for that to happen, but I think Richeche is very, very appealing at that spot. I mentioned Dillingham before. He's more of that small guard. Stephon Castle has been talked about up there for some people from UConn. A wing, 6'5", 6'6", 6'9" wingspan, really good defender, questionable jump shot. That's kind of what's holding him back a little bit. Is he a point guard? Is he not? I also need to be a point guard, but there you go. Cody Williams from Colorado. I wouldn't take him that high. Ron Holland of G League Ignite, also Midas Buzelis of G League Ignite, are two of the guys that I have personally in my top 5 or 6 on my board that have had kind of weird seasons. G League Ignite was kind of an interesting bad collection of on-floor pieces this year, but I think those guys individually got pushed down too far. They're actually underrated as prospects. Ron Holland's a super athletic two-way forward. Buzelis is a little bit more skilled, a little bit taller. I think he's like 6'9" or so, 6'10", a pretty interesting player. I can keep going, but certainly they have options. I do think that Sarr is the guy that we're going to end up talking about maybe the most in the next 6 weeks, but it's not a one-player thing. I'll just say that right now. And again, this is going to be a brief podcast, but that's where I am at this moment in time. And the last thing before we get out of here on this emergency podcast, and I promise you I'll have more in the next 24 hours on this feed, but is do you make the pick or do you trade the pick? I did a whole segment on this actually last week on the show, and I will repeat some of that here because it was theoretical then and it was like really unlikely then, and now it's real. Now we're here. And my answer basically is I would take calls on number one overall. And I still feel the same way now, even with them having the pick versus them theoretically having the pick. Now, that does not mean that I would trade the pick. That means I would consider it. In some drafts, you don't even consider it. Last year, Wembanyama, as soon as the Spurs won the lottery, they were taking him. There was no discussion to be had. Same thing with the Pelicans and Zion, AD back in the day. There are a handful of prospects every decade or so that you don't even think about it within reason. This is not one of those times. Even if you love Alex Sarr, he is not Wemby. He is not Zion as far as prospect status. So if someone wanted to pay a traditional price associated with the number one overall pick, I would listen. Doesn't mean you take it, but I would definitely listen if I was the Hawks, because for what I know right now, is I would take Sarr number one, but he is not in a tier of his own for me at this very moment. If he becomes a tier of his own, that just kind of raises the price tag a little bit. And this is a young front office. This is a front office that's never had this opportunity before, or an asset like this that kind of lord over the league. We'll see how they kind of handle that, but I would at least take offers. Doesn't mean you have to trade it. Just means you have to take offers. If they don't, that's totally fine. You make the pick. You pick the guy that you think is the best player, and I'm totally fine with that. If the Hawks are in love with someone, we won't know it probably for a while, but if they are, I'm fine. By the way, you don't lower the price. You set the price tag high in a trade offer, like, hey, blow me away. Sure. And yeah, I would like to keep, if you were to trade the pick, it'd be nice to keep a high pick, to sort of keep a high pick or a high prospect. You could trade down, like, for instance, the Wizards got number 2 pick, Rockets below that, Spurs below that. Maybe there's a deal with the Spurs, or the Spurs send you some of your pick capital back that you traded them in the past. There's stuff out there. I'm not trying to go through all the hypotheticals right now. And by the way, they are hypotheticals. It's extremely recent. It just happened within the last hours I'm recording this podcast, but there are options here. I think the most likely scenario is the Hawks stay number one and they make a pick. That's always the most likely scenario until you hear otherwise, intel-wise. And right now, as of May 12th, I think the Hawks, if I had to make a bet, would be picking at number one and picking the player they like the most. But they could trade it. It would not surprise me, and it shouldn't surprise you if they were to trade it. They have so many other things going on right now. They have organizational decisions to make, especially with regard to trading DeJounte. We all kind of know that. We all kind of understand the deal there, but they got to make for me, a decision there is almost as important or as important as making the pick. It's that important. It's like, all right, what are you going to do there? And then set the tone. You're restructuring your franchise. I can already see it now. People are going to have expectations for this pick that are probably too high. That's the nature of the beast with number one overall. That's the one thing that, at the end of the day, if somebody says you can have the pick or not have the pick, you take the pick, obviously. But it's like that player is going to come along with some expectations. More salary, that's actually a small wrinkle that we'll get into later on, but the number one overall pick is guaranteed a much, much, much higher salary as a rookie than the 10th pick is, and the Hawks have money questions. I won't even say they're concerned, just tax questions we'll get into later on. But anyway, lots to get into, but it's a great day for the Hawks. Great day for Hawks fans. Everybody's fired up, as they should be. They could take the entire board. It could be Sarr, it could be Reese Shea, it could be Donovan Clingan, it could be all these guys. It could be whoever the Hawks want it to be. People are going to have opinions. I will share mine. We'll have an open dialogue. I'll have tons of guests. I'm trying to get people that have different viewpoints and all that stuff. Nobody's gospel. I've been wrong plenty. I've been wrong before on draft stuff. I've been right before on draft stuff. I do the work. I try to get some stuff in, but hopefully you'll be along for the ride. So I'll cut it off here on this emergency podcast. We'll have much, much, much more in the future. Please subscribe to this podcast. If you are just finding us for the first time, it's a great time, I got to say, to subscribe to the show on YouTube or on Apple or on Spotify, Overcast. Like the show on YouTube as well. 5-star ratings and reviews. Please spread the word about the podcast. You can find us anywhere, but go ahead and follow us on Twitter as well at Locked On Hawks. Follow me there as well at BT Rowland. I write about the Hawks sometimes at patreon.com/BT Rowland. I share some press conference stuff there, extra audio. That's a good place to kind of support my overall work, not associated with the podcast, but just my own stuff there. And thanks for listening, everybody. My apologies for this sort of scattershot nature. I'll have much more of a traditional polished episode coming up in the near future. So stay tuned. We'll see you all next time.